You were taught that Thomas Jefferson bought Louisiana from Napoleon. He didn't. He bought it from a bank in London, and that same bank then wired the cash straight to Napoleon, while Napoleon was massing an army on the coast to invade Britain. A third of what is now the United States changed hands in 1803 for $15 million. The problem is that the United States did not have $15 million. Its entire federal budget that year was smaller than the price tag. So who actually paid for it? This isn't a conspiracy theory. Every figure in the next 30 minutes sits in bank archives, treasury records, and the surviving correspondence of the men who cut the deal. The names are real, the bonds still exist, and the punchline is documented in the ledgers of the bank itself. A British firm financed the sworn enemy of Britain in the middle of a war, and everyone involved knew it. So today, we follow the money behind the greatest land deal in history. Not the romance of manifest destiny, the invoice underneath it. Who was broke? Who was desperate? And the detail we end on, the one that should make you tilt your head. The price of a third of a continent was set, in the end, by a slave revolt and a mosquito. Keep that in mind. At the end, I'm going to ask you for a verdict. A third of a continent on credit. Start with the object itself, because the scale is hard to hold in your head. In the spring of 1803, the United States agreed to buy the Louisiana Territory from France. Not the modern state of Louisiana, the whole territory, roughly 800,000 square miles running up the spine of the continent from New Orleans to the Canadian border. Land that would eventually become all or part of 15 American states. In one signature, the young republic doubled in size. The price was 80 million francs, about $15 million. Work it out per acre, and it comes to something near 4 cents. In today's money, the 15 million is on the order of a few $100 million, though any conversion across 2 centuries is a rough gauge, not a precise number, and the land itself is beyond pricing. By the standard of what was bought, it was the cheapest transfer of territory in the history of the world. And here is the puzzle that the schoolbook version skips right past. The United States could not afford it. The federal government in 1803 took in around $11 or $12 million in a whole year, almost all of it from customs duties on trade. It had a few million on hand in the treasury. It was being asked to pay $15 million in cash to a French dictator who wanted the money immediately and did not trust American promises to pay later. A broke republic, a price larger than its annual budget, and a seller who demanded coin up front. On paper, the deal was impossible. So how does a country that cannot cover its own payroll buy a third of the continent? It doesn't pay. It borrows. And the lenders are not American. To understand why Napoleon was selling it all, you have to leave North America entirely and sail to a small Caribbean island, because that island is where the real price of Louisiana was paid, in blood, before a single franc changed hands. Napoleon never wanted Louisiana as farmland for Americans. He wanted an empire in the New World, and the crown jewel of that empire was not Louisiana at all. It was Saint-Domingue, the French colony on the western half of the island of Hispaniola, the place we now call Haiti. In the 1780s, Saint-Domingue had been the single most profitable colony on earth, a machine that produced a huge share of the world's sugar and coffee, and it ran on the most brutal system of plantation slavery in the Caribbean. Louisiana, in Napoleon's plan, was only the supporting actor. It was meant to be the breadbasket, the granary that would grow the food to feed the enslaved workforce on the sugar island. No Saint-Domingue, no reason for Louisiana. But by the time Napoleon took power, the enslaved people of Saint-Domingue had already risen up. The revolt that began in 1791, led eventually by the former slave Toussaint Louverture, had turned into a full revolution, and the colony's black population had won something close to freedom and self-rule. Napoleon decided to take it back and to restore slavery. In 1801 and 1802, he sent one of the largest expeditions of the age across the Atlantic. Tens of thousands of soldiers and sailors, some of the best troops in the French army, under the command of his own brother-in-law, General Charles Leclerc. It became a catastrophe with few equals in military history. The Haitian revolutionaries fought a scorched-earth guerrilla war, burning the ports rather than surrendering them. And then their most powerful ally arrived, an ally no army could fight: yellow fever. The mosquito-borne disease tore through the French ranks, which had no immunity and no idea what was killing them. Soldiers went from healthy to dead in days, vomiting black blood. Estimates of the French dead run to 50,000 and beyond over the course of the campaign. Leclerc himself, Napoleon's brother-in-law, died of the fever in November 1802. His replacement answered the resistance with mass drownings and what he openly called a war of extermination, and the atrocity only hardened the revolution against him. Count the dead honestly before we get back to the money, because this is the true cost accounting of the Louisiana Purchase. Tens of thousands of French soldiers died on that island. Far more Haitians died in the fighting, in the reprisals, in the mass killings. People who had been born into slavery and chose to die free rather than be re-enslaved. On the first day of 1804, the survivors declared independence and named their country Haiti, the second free republic in the Western Hemisphere and the only nation ever born from a successful slave revolution. They had destroyed the finest army Napoleon could send. And when Napoleon lost the Sugar Island, Louisiana became worthless to him overnight. A granary with no plantation to feed. So he decided to turn it into cash. There is the reveal the textbooks bury. The single largest land transfer in American history did not happen because Jefferson was a brilliant negotiator or Napoleon was a fool. It happened because enslaved people in Haiti, fighting for their own freedom, wrecked Napoleon's dream of a new world empire and left him holding a vast territory he could no longer defend or use, right as he needed money for a new war in Europe. The people who set the price of Louisiana never saw a penny of it, and most of them were never even mentioned in the deal. Keep that ledger open. The republic that couldn't pay. Now cross back to the American side, where the story is almost comic. Jefferson had not sent anyone to Paris to buy a continent. He had sent them to buy a city. The worry in Washington was narrow and practical. New Orleans sat at the mouth of the Mississippi, and the Mississippi was a highway for every farmer west of the Appalachians. A farmer in Kentucky or Ohio floated his grain and his whiskey down the river on flatboats, transferred it at New Orleans, and shipped it out to the world. Whoever held New Orleans could choke off the trade and the livelihood of everyone west of the mountains with a single order. For years, that port had belonged to Spain, a weak and fading power the Americans could live with. Then came a rumor, and then a confirmation, that turned the worry into fear. In a secret treaty, signed at San Ildefonso in 1800, Spain had quietly agreed to hand Louisiana back to France. A decaying Spanish landlord was one thing. Napoleon Bonaparte, the most dangerous man in the world, sitting astride the mouth of the Mississippi, was something else entirely. And then trigger. In the autumn of 1802, the Spanish official still running New Orleans abruptly suspended what was called the right of deposit, the American privilege of stashing goods in the port tax-free while waiting for ocean ships. Overnight, the Western economy seized up, and the frontier erupted. There were open calls in Congress and in the Western states to raise an army and simply seize New Orleans by force. Jefferson, who had no wish for a war with France, tried to buy his way out of the crisis instead. He dispatched Robert Livingston and James Monroe to Paris with authorization to spend up to around $10 million to buy New Orleans and a strip of Florida, a port, and the peace of mind that came with it. That was the whole assignment. They arrived to a shock. Napoleon's minister asked, almost casually, whether the Americans would like to buy not just New Orleans, but the entire territory, all 800,000 square miles of it. The negotiators had no authority to do any such thing. There was no time to write home and ask. A letter across the Atlantic took weeks each way. So Livingston and Monroe made the most consequential improvised decision in American history and said yes, blowing through their instructions by a factor of many times over. Back home, Jefferson had a different kind of crisis, and it was a crisis of principle. Jefferson was the great strict reader of the Constitution, the man who insisted the federal government could do only what the document explicitly allowed. And the Constitution said nothing whatsoever about buying foreign territory from an emperor. By his own philosophy, the purchase was probably illegal, and he privately fretted that he ought to pass a constitutional amendment first. Then he looked at the map and at the chance to double the country for 4 cents an acre, and he swallowed his principles whole. The purist bent his own rule because the deal was too big to refuse. Presidents have been doing that ever since. But principle was the easy problem. The hard problem was arithmetic. And here the real hero of the American side steps forward, a man almost nobody remembers. Albert Gallatin, Jefferson's Treasury Secretary, a Swiss immigrant with a genius for public finance. Gallatin was the one who had to solve the impossible sum, the one where a government with a few $1 million in the till somehow pays $15 million to a man who wants it now. His answer was pure financial engineering, and it is the reason this is a price of war story and not a footnote in a textbook. Enter the bankers. Gallatin's structure was elegant. Of the $15 million, $3.75 million would never be paid to France at all. Instead, the United States would assume responsibility for old debts that France owed to American merchants, wiping those out as part of the price. That left $11.25 million owed to Napoleon, and that amount the United States would pay not in cash, which it did not have, but in bonds. Government IOUs paying 6% interest, redeemable over about 15 years. The Republic would buy a continent on an installment plan. There was just one problem, and it was Napoleon. He did not want bonds. Bonds are a promise to pay later, and later was no good to a man about to go to war. On top of that, the United States in 1803 was, in the language of modern finance, an emerging market, a young, untested country that had existed for barely 20 years and might well default. American paper was high-risk paper, and Napoleon knew it. He wanted hard money, fast, from someone he trusted, and he did not trust the United States. So the deal could only happen if someone stood in the middle, someone with enough capital to hand Napoleon cash now, take the risky American, and sell those bonds slowly to investors across Europe. That someone was a bank. 2 banks, in fact, the 2 most powerful merchant banking houses on the planet, Baring Brothers of London and Hope and Company of Amsterdam. Barings took 60% of the deal. Hope took 40%. Look closely at what these houses actually did, because it is a masterpiece of financial plumbing, and it is exactly how big money still works today. Alexander Baring and his partner Pierre Labouchere went to Paris and sat down, not across from the French, but alongside them, negotiating to buy France's American bonds for resale. The bankers bought the $11.25 million of United States bonds from France at a discount, paying roughly 52 million francs, something on the order of 12.5% below face value. Then they carried those bonds back to London and Amsterdam and sold them, piece by piece, to private investors hungry for a safe 6% return. The gap between what they paid France and what they collected from investors was their profit, a spread running to well over $1 million in the money of the day. Buy low from a desperate seller, sell high to a calm market, pocket the difference. Name the trick, because you will see it in every crisis this channel ever covers. The logistics alone tell you the world these men lived in. The bonds were physical objects, printed certificates that had to cross the Atlantic by sailing ship, an 8-week voyage each way. They were so valuable and the sea so dangerous that copies were sent in triplicate on separate ships, in case one went to the bottom. The first batch was handed to Alexander Baring in Washington in January 1804. Long before that, Napoleon had grown so desperate for money that the bankers advanced France a fortune out of their own pockets, 10 million francs, months ahead of schedule, just to keep the emperor happy. And the Republic did something that surprised the men who had bet against it. It paid. Year after year, the 6% interest went out on schedule, in Amsterdam and in London, exactly as written, and the whole principle was cleared by the early 1820s. For a country that hard-nosed European bankers had treated as a coin flip, that was a quiet turning point. The Louisiana bonds were among the very first American securities ever sold on the international market, and by honoring them to the letter, in wartime, through every political storm at home, the United States rewrote its own credit rating in front of the entire financial world. Been bought. Something less visible had been bought along with it: the reputation for paying, the same habit that made Britain unbeatable, and it would be worth more to America over the next century than the land itself. So here is the thing to sit with. Napoleon did not really trust the United States to pay him. He trusted the bank. In the end, America did not buy Louisiana from Napoleon. America bought it from Banning Brothers. Sir Francis Baring, the patriarch of the firm, understood exactly how large a bet his family was making on this untested young country. He confessed in a letter that they all trembled at the magnitude of the American account. It was the biggest financial commitment the House had ever made, and it was riding on the survival and honesty of a republic most of the British establishment still regarded as a jumped-up colony that might collapse at any moment. The bank that financed the enemy. And now the reveal this whole story has been walking toward. The fact that turns a real estate transaction into something out of a spy novel. Because of the timing. The Louisiana deal was agreed at the end of April 1803. Within weeks, in May 1803, the fragile peace between Britain and France collapsed, and the two nations went back to war. The war that would rage, with one short interruption until Waterloo in 1815. Which means the money did not stop flowing when the shooting started. It kept flowing. All through 1803 and 1804, Baring Brothers, a British bank headquartered in the city of London, continued transferring millions in hard money to the government of Napoleon Bonaparte, to the enemy, in the middle of the war. And follow where that money went, because this is the part that should stop you cold. In those same months, Napoleon was assembling a vast army on the cliffs of Boulogne, on the French coast, in plain sight of England. The Army of England, he called it, a force gathered for one purpose: to cross the Channel and invade Britain. The cash that a London bank was funneling to Napoleon flowed into the same war chest that was paying for the boats, the camps, and the soldiers massed to conquer London. While British mothers along the south coast lay awake listening for French landing craft, a British bank was quietly financing the man building them, and it was completely legal. It was fully informed, and it let the deal proceed anyway, on a piece of cold strategic logic that tells you everything about how these men thought. Getting Louisiana into American hands meant getting it permanently out of French hands. A neutral, weak United States sitting on that territory was far less dangerous to Britain than a resurgent French empire straddling the Mississippi. So London decided it was worth handing Napoleon a pile of cash today to deny him a continent forever. The territory was the prize. The money was just the fee. Sit with the full shape of it. A slave revolt in the Caribbean destroys Napoleon's American empire. Needing war money, he sells the leftovers to a republic that cannot afford them. That republic pays with IOUs it cannot honor in cash. A British bank buys the IOUs, hands Napoleon real money, and sells the debt to European investors, taking its cut. And the war that money helps fund is the war Napoleon is about to wage against the very country that bank calls home. Money crossed the front line more easily than any spy, any army, any idea. It always does. That is the lesson under every episode on this channel, and 1803 is where you can see it in its purest form. The ledger nobody signed. Before we talk about who profited, we have to finish counting who paid, because the celebration of the Louisiana Purchase as the greatest bargain in history leaves an enormous bill unmentioned. The land that Jefferson bought for 4 cents an acre was not empty. It was home to dozens of native nations, hundreds of thousands of people, the Osage, the Comanche, the Sioux, the Pawnee, and many more, who had lived on and governed that territory for centuries, and who were never consulted, never paid, and never asked. France sold, and America bought, land that neither of them actually controlled or occupied. What the purchase really transferred was not the land itself, but a legal claim, a piece of paper that the United States would spend the next century enforcing at gunpoint, through treaty after broken treaty, removal after removal, until the original inhabitants had been pushed onto a fraction of what had been theirs. The bargain of the century, for one people, was the opening page, and there is a second bill. All that new territory, that vast open expanse running up the Mississippi Valley, became the arena for the great American fight over slavery. Much of it was open to the expansion of the plantation system, feeding the Cotton Kingdom and the domestic slave trade, and setting up the fault line that would crack the country open in Civil War 60 years later. The land bought with money handed to Napoleon by a British bank helped extend American slavery for another 2 generations. Freedom won in Haiti helped expand bondage in America. History does not do clean endings. Now the profit ledger, held up against all of that. Baring Brothers walked away with a spread of well over $1 million, and more importantly, with its reputation as the bank that had financed the impossible. The house went on to become the most powerful in the world, so powerful that a French statesman would later joke that Europe now held 6 great powers, and the 6th was Baring Brothers. Alexander Baring, the young man who negotiated it, married an American heiress and tied his family fortune to the country whose debts he had gambled on. Napoleon, the United States, got a continent. On credit, it would finish paying off around 1823. And the Haitians who had set the whole thing in motion got their freedom, and a generation later, a crushing debt of their own, extorted by France as the price of recognition, a debt that would strangle Haiti's economy for over a century. The dead were counted in the tens of thousands. The winners were counted in the counting houses. What the historians actually fight about. This is where the honest debate lives. Historians and economists agree on the mechanics. They argue about the meaning. One camp treats the purchase as the birth of modern American high finance. On this view, 1803 is the moment the United States first went to the international capital markets, issued securities that traded in London and Amsterdam, and crucially, honored them, paying the interest on time and the principal in full. That performance turned American debt from high-risk emerging market paper to a trustworthy asset, and it is the foundation the whole later American financial century was built on. The economic historian, Larry Neal, in his recent study of what he calls the forgotten financiers of the Louisiana Purchase, traces exactly how Barings and Hope made the deal work and why it mattered far beyond the land. Another camp, represented by popular historians like Thomas Fleming, keep the focus on contingency, on how much of this turned on pure chance. Napoleon does not sell if the yellow fever does not destroy his army. The Americans do not get the whole territory if their negotiators do not gamble beyond their orders. The deal does not close if 2 banks do not happen to have the capacity and the nerve to warehouse the risk. Change any one of those, and the map of North America looks different. In this telling, the Louisiana Purchase is less a triumph of strategy than a cascade of accidents that happened to break in America's favor. And there is a running argument about Napoleon himself. One reading has him fleeced, handing over a continent for a pittance. The other has him making the only rational move left on the board, cashing out a territory he could never have defended against the British Navy anyway, and pocketing money he urgently needed for a war he meant to win. Good historians land in different places. The one thing none of them dispute is that a bank stood in the middle and made the whole thing possible. The line we do not cross. So let's calibrate, because a story about bankers secretly financing both sides of a war is catnip for a certain kind of paranoia, and it needs to be handled with care. The crude version says, a shadowy cabal of financiers engineered the whole thing, pulling the strings of nations for hidden profit. That version is false, and the documents will kill it. These were named public firms, Barings and Hope, competing fiercely with each other for the business, operating inside rules set by governments, trembling openly about the risk, and taking an ordinary commercial commission for an ordinary, if enormous, commercial service. There was no puppet master. There was a spread on the archives, exactly as any investment bank would earn today. And refused the opposite fairy tale too, the patriotic postcard version, where the Louisiana Purchase was simply Jefferson's brilliant bargain, a clean and glorious step in America's destiny. That story is a comfort, and it is a lie by omission. The deal was forced by a slave revolt Jefferson feared and refused to support. It was made possible by the enemy's bank. It was paid for over 2 decades by American taxpayers, and it was carried out on land whose owners were never asked, opening that land to the spread of slavery. Intent and effect pull in different directions all through the story. Napoleon meant to fund a war he would lose. Jefferson meant to buy a port and bought an empire. Bankers meant to earn a fee and built a dynasty. To tell it as pure American genius, or as pure American conspiracy, is to tell it with the spine pulled out. So what we are actually looking at? Step back and look at the whole machine. Enslaved people in Haiti destroyed Napoleon's New World Empire and hand him a territory he cannot use. Needing war cash, he puts a third of a continent up for sale. A broke American republic wants a single port and finds itself buying the lot on credit, against its own constitution. 2 European banks turn that credit into tradable paper, hand the emperor's money, and sell the risk to investors. A British bank finances the enemy of Britain, with London's blessing, while that enemy builds an army to invade London. And a continent changes hands on sheets of paper carried across. Every gear turns the next. Pull out the financial gear, the bank in the middle, and the whole thing seizes up. There is no Louisiana Purchase without a merchant bank willing to fund Napoleon in wartime. And the pattern did not retire in 1804. Nations still buy things they cannot afford by turning to a bond market that does not care about borders. Money still crosses front lines that armies cannot. Governments still find that their own banks, their own investors, their own currencies are quietly financing the other side of a conflict. Through debt and trade, and the simple fact that capital chases return wherever it lives. The specific machinery from 1803 has new names now: sovereign bonds, foreign reserves, financial sanctions. But the logic is the same one Alexander Bering understood 2 centuries ago. The nation with the deepest and most trusted credit can reach across any war and shape the map. And the banker in the middle takes his cut whichever way the guns are pointed. Here's a line to take to dinner. America didn't buy Louisiana from Napoleon. It bought it from a London bank, which then paid Napoleon the money to build an army to invade Britain. Which brings us to the verdict, and I want yours. Given everything in the ledgers, 3 men have a claim to have won the Louisiana Purchase. Thomas Jefferson, who doubled his country for 4 cents an acre and bent his own constitution to do it. Napoleon, who turned a worthless territory into a war chest at the exact moment he needed one. And Baring Brothers, the bank that took a commission from everyone, financed both a continent and the war against its own nation, and walked away the 6th great power of Europe. The statesman, the emperor, or the banker? Tell me in the comments who actually came out ahead. A genius bargain, or the greatest fire sale in history priced by a mosquito? I read every comment, and I want to be convinced. If you follow the money all the way from a Caribbean battlefield to a London counting house, drop a single gold coin emoji in the comments so I know who made it to the end. Subscribe, because we are following the money through every deal that history dressed up as destiny. And the story of the bank in the middle, Baring Brothers, and how it became powerful enough to be called a great power in its own right, deserves its own episode.